About 5 years ago, I heard a message that really, really changed the way I perceived my marriage relationship. And so credit where credit's due, today's message, about 3/4 of today's message comes from Andy Stanley. And Andy says that we all, no matter where you're at, when it comes to relationship, all of us, we all have a box, an invisible box of hopes. We all have wishes or hopes for our relationship. And if you're single, you're not dating anybody, this is a very undefined box for you. But as you move into a relationship and as you think about moving toward a relationship, this box becomes more defined. Some hopes, some wishes as it relates to future relationship. And if you're engaged, hopefully you've already talked about what's in your box and you've heard from your fiance what's in their box. But if you're married, we should definitely know what's in our spouse's box. And some of us do, and some of us don't. And that's going to be part of the problem that we're going to discuss. We all have hopes. We all think about the future, and we have these hopes as it relates to these things. Money. In our marriage, we're going to have a lot of money, or we're not going to have any money. Love will just keep us alive. We're going to live on hope. We're going to have a single income, 2 incomes, or we're just going to have so much income that we're just going to all stay home. We're going to have a budget. No, I know we're not going to have a budget because that sounds like an allowance, and I don't want an allowance. We have all of these expectations, these hopes as it relates to our financial future. Or maybe you have some ideas about how the chores are going to be done. Who's going to be doing? You think about how it happened in your family or the way that you feel like it should happen. You have hopes as far as some kind of home. You're going to rent or purchase a car, what you're going to drive, or maybe you'll talk him into trading his sports car for something a little bit more practical that the car seat can fit in, Maybe you're going to have a child, or maybe if you're an only child, you're going to thinking, I don't just want one. I'm going to have some children. Or maybe if we have 2 girls, we're just going to keep going till we get a boy. So maybe that was we all have hopes and dreams as it relates to those things. So you also have a mental picture of what scheduling in a relationship looks like, how we spend our free time. I get to spend time with my friends, you spend time with your friend, or no, we ditch our friends, we spend all our time together, And then there is hopes and dreams as it has to do with the calendar. So, as far as holidays, we're going to spend Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter with my family, and your family can have all the other ones. You get Groundhog Day and President's Day and Ash Wednesday. You get all those. I'm generous. But we all have this picture of how all of this is going to work out in our relationships in the future. This is how we're going to live together. And then there's travel. We're going to travel a lot. We're going to travel all over the world. Or no, we're going to keep it in the United States. I'm scared to go outside of the country. And then every guy has some idea of what he hopes and dreams that his wife will not wear to bed. And she's thinking, well, yeah, but he loves me. He just wants me to be comfortable. He doesn't care. He accepts me just like I am. Yeah. And then, those things that I wear at night, that's not going to matter. And then there's conflict resolution. How we resolve conflict in marriage. That's what we're talking about within a relationship. And so, there's conflict. We've discussed it in every relationship. And the hope is that we're just going to talk it out. We're going to get it all out on the table. We're going to be completely honest. We're going to be extremely honest so we can just work through things. And then somebody else is thinking, no, that's how you hurt people's feelings. Like, you don't say everything that's true. You just make sure that what you say is true. And so then, the other person says, no, in my family, we raised our voices and we got it all out. And the other person, no, we're not going to raise our voices because if you raise your voice, then, that's insensitive. You just don't, that's not how we're going to resolve conflict. And some guys are thinking conflict resolution, that's what sex is for. Who hasn't been married very long. But the question is, how are we going to behave with each other? What's our hopes? My husband, my fiance, my wife, she's never going to say this. She's never going to use that term. He's never going to threaten. There's this expectation that we've never defined. but we have a pretty clear expectation about how we're going to be treated in this very special relationship. She loves me, she'll never. He loves me, he'll never. Now, as we discussed before, unmet expectations are the source of almost all of our conflict. And that's why we're in this series that we have called How to Fight. Because as we've discovered, it's not that you're not going to fight. Conflict is inevitable, but we've got to learn strategies to actually be able to fight correctly, to fight constructively, to let iron sharpen iron. But when our hopes don't match a reality, that creates this gap called disappointment. So, how do you manage that? When our dreams and our hopes of what a relationship would be doesn't actually meet reality, and there's this gap of disappointment in the middle. Because all of us know what it's like to have disappointment in our relationships. Do you remember when you walked down the aisle? And, here were all the dreams and the hopes, and then afterward, when we see reality, it kind of sometimes it feels like false advertising, doesn't it? Yeah. Maybe it's a friendship and you used to rely on it, but now your relationship feels distant. Or maybe it's a family member, and with this family member, it's begun to feel more like conflict and competition, where there used to be a closeness and a connection, but there's been this disconnect. And all of us, we want close relationships. We want to close the gap, but sometimes the reality doesn't actually meet our hopes. And at some point during our marriage relationships, or maybe when you're dating, or once you get engaged, or it could even be at the altar, or it could be months or years after you're married, at some point we can't help ourselves. We take our box of hope and we say, here, make them a reality for me. Make my dreams come true. This is always I dreamed about. This was my hopes. This is the reason I asked you out. This is the reason I said yes when you asked me out. It was the reason why I asked you to marry me. It's the reason why you said yes. It's the reason I walked down the aisle with you, because in my mind, this is what the future looks like. And I need you to come through for me. The problem is that when we hand somebody our box of hopes, it doesn't feel like hopes to them. To them, it feels a lot like expectations, right? Then it feels like this weight. It feels like the bar has actually been raised. To them, it feels like a homework assignment, or an assignment, or a responsibility now. It feels like if they don't come through, then you might be disappointed in them. And what before was intangible and dreamy and hopeful, and I spent years thinking about all these things and planning all this and envisioning it, suddenly your hopes become a burden to somebody else. So today, we're going to talk about expectations. And I want to start out by talking about unhealthy expectations. So, what are some unhealthy expectations? First of all is what we call unconscious expectations. We don't even know that we have these expectations until they go unmet. And then we feel the disappointment, the pain of that disappointment. Maybe you expect your spouse to keep the house clean because in your house, that's what your mom did. Or maybe your husband should be Mr. Handyman because your dad was, or your husband should fill up your car with gas all the time because that's what your dad did for your mom. Or your wife, she should be a good cook because my mom was a good cook and I loved it. We have these weird, unconscious expectations where we kind of think, well, that's just what their whole world, everybody, all families are like this. But it's not true. Another one is what we call unreasonable expectation. And it's just, these expectations aren't just grounded in reality. When we daydream about the future, our future as we daydream and as we imagine, it organizes itself around our box and our dreams. See, when I was single, I never daydreamed about becoming the perfect someone for somebody else. No, I daydreamed about finding the perfect somebody for me. We don't daydream about, wow, I just can't wait till I become the perfect somebody for somebody else. No. We daydream about finding the perfect somebody for me. So when I met Melissa, I thought she was perfect for me. So I brought her ring and my box of hopes to the altar. And everything in my box seems perfectly reasonable to me. Why would everybody not want to center their life around what's in my box? And she brought her box to the altar, and everything in her box seemed perfectly reasonable to her. And many of the hopes that we brought into our relationship, they weren't reasonable to the other person. Now, sometimes expectations can be reasonable. The problem is that they are unspoken. We never actually verbalize and voice them out loud with our words. And some unhealthy expectations are unspoken, and we have to say them, no matter how obvious they might be to you. They might not be obvious to the other person. Now, another one is unagreed. Just because you expect these things, just because they're your dreams and your hopes, doesn't mean they agreed to it. You never agreed to be the handyman. She never agreed to pick up your underwear off the floor all the time like your mommy did. See, these expectations, they actually have to be agreed upon. And the problem is that when we hand our box of hopes to somebody else, the weight changes, and what feels to me like a hope, to her felt like an expectation. And the difference is, on this side of the box, it's all hopes. On this side of the box, it's all expectations. Because I'm like, why would everybody not want to order their life like my box? And the other person says, yeah, that just feels like a lot of expectations to me. I mean, like from where I'm standing, it feels like hopes. From where they're standing, it feels like all expectations. And eventually, the relationship is characterized like this, by an owe-repay relationship. You owe me my hopes. That's what husbands are supposed to do. That's what wives are supposed to do. That's what men are supposed to do in a relationship. That's how women are supposed to, respect me in a relationship. And if we know, then what happens is we're negotiating, and it's all about you owe me, you owe me, you owe me. And the problem is, when you get into this dynamic, when you get into this space, you can't recognize love. You can't give or receive love because you can't appreciate it or recognize it. Let me explain it this way. If you owe me money, you can't give me money. If you owe me money and then you give me money, I don't see it as a gift. I see it as a payment. If you owe me money and you say, hey, Mike, I appreciate what you're doing and I'd just like to give you $100. Well, if you owe me more than $100, not only am I not grateful, I want to know where the rest of it is. So what happens in a relationship is gratefulness becomes minimal. When the dynamic of the relationship is an owe-repay relationship, as long as somebody feels like somebody else owes them, they don't see the fulfillment of that as love because it's only repaying what my expectation that you owe me actually are. So it's not thank you for cleaning the house or thank you for fixing that light. No, you owed them that. Because of your hopes and expectations of reality that maybe have been unconscious, unspoken, unrealistic, unagreed upon, or unreasonable. And when our hopes fall in one of these categories and they go unmet or unexamined by us, then we start making judgments about that person or assumptions about that person. And that's where that disappointment comes in. The pain, that's when it shows up. And resentment starts to build up, and then there's a wall between us. Have you ever been there? Maybe you're there now. I know, I've been there. It's so familiar. I know so many of us have been there or are there. But if we don't deal with this, if it goes unexamined or unresolved, you know what? Marriages fall apart. They just collapse. Families fall apart. So what do we do? The question then is, how do we keep this from happening? How do we keep, legitimate hopes from starting to feel like expectations? And the answer is, we answer this question. And this is the question, what does he or she actually owe me? I married them. Certainly they owe me something. And I think we get the answer to that question from, surprisingly enough, Jesus. And as we kind of dig into these scriptures, you're going to find out what Jesus said about this subject. It is transformative. It will transform your relationship if it's just applied. Now, a little bit of backstory on the scriptures that we're getting ready to dive into today. At the end of Jesus' ministry, he's hours away from being arrested. And so he gathers his disciples up together and he says, hey guys, there's a couple things I want you to remember. And then toward the end of that time, as they're sharing the last Passover, he says, I'm going to give you a brand new command. Now, these Jewish guys that were with him, his disciples, they would have actually been offended by him even saying that. And it doesn't bother us because we don't understand the culture. But in their culture, the only person that could give a command was God. And God already gave them all through Moses. So you could talk about the commands, you could explain the commands, you could apply the commands, but you can't just go making up new commands. That would have been offensive. So Jesus is jacking them up, and he says, hey guys, I'm going to give you a new command. And here's what he said. He said, a new command I give you, love one another, which they would have responded like, well, that's not new, which Jesus would have said, well, hang on, I'm not done yet. He said, a new command that I give you, love one another as I have loved you. This is the new part, so that you must love one another like that. And Jesus could have gone around to each one of them and said, hey, do you remember when we met? Matthew, you were a tax collector. You were an embarrassment to the whole nation, your family. And do you remember what I said to you? And Matthew would say, yeah, you asked me to follow you. And Jesus would have said to Matthew, I want you to extend that kind of love and grace and mercy to everybody you meet. Peter, you remember how you didn't want Matthew following us because he was an embarrassment, because he was a tax collector, and you remember I let both of you stay in the club? Peter, I want you to extend that kind of grace and that kind of mercy to everybody you meet. Nathaniel, you remember when we met? You remember Nathaniel? You insulted my whole family, my whole community, my whole city. You see, Jesus was from a place called Nazareth, and Nathaniel, when he heard about Jesus, he goes, he's from Nazareth? What good thing could come from Nazareth? And so he would say, hey, you remember Nathaniel? You dishonored my whole family. You made us all sound like losers. You remember that? Yeah, I remember that, Jesus. But you remember I still invited you to follow me, and I never brought it up again. See, he could have gone around the room and he could have said to each disciple, I want you to think about how I treated you. That's why, or how I want you to treat everybody else. A few hours later, he would have been arrested, tried, crucified. And that would be an aha moment for each of these guys when they realized that Jesus gave his life on our behalf and he asked us to do the same. There's a golden rule. You remember it? Treat people like you want to be treated. But what Jesus said was taking that a step up. He's like, treat people the way that you want them to treat you, but take it to another level. He gave us a different command, which is love one another as I have loved you. And this is huge because every single New Testament command after the resurrection, it actually springboards off of this big idea. As I love you, you've got to love other people. And a few years later, the Apostle Paul will take this big idea of love others as Jesus has loved us, and he would begin to apply it in all of his letters to all kinds of relationships, including marriage. And so in his letter to Ephesus, the city, he applies this command to marriage, and here's how he does it. He says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do the Lord. And what could be any clearer than that? All right, let's pray. Time to go home. If this bothers you, I'm glad. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad it bothers you, because some of you are saying, now see, this is why I don't want to have anything to do with the church, anything to do with Christianity. And listen, I am glad that you're here today and you're listening today, because this is going to change everything for you. Our English Bibles, the New Testament portion where this comes from, is translated from Greek text. And if you take this verse and you translate it literally, here's what it actually says. It says, wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. There's no verb there. in the original Greek. The word submit is not actually there in that verse. Now, before I explain why, I want to explain something else. When Paul's first century audience actually heard him teach about women submitting to their husbands, we go, hang on just a second, that sounds a little misogynistic, a little sexist. But in their culture, they would have been like, yeah, of course. Because this was actually common. This would not have surprised or offended anybody, including women listening. Believe it or not, nobody was offended because in Roman culture, Greek culture, and even the Jews had a version of this, there was a rule that men had legal jurisdiction over their children and their wives. So basically, their children and wives belonged to the men. So when Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands, it'd be like, okay, yeah, I mean, we get that, duh. Based upon our culture. It wasn't a big deal to them based upon culture. But it's a huge deal to us because we know better. How do we know better? Is that it's just women submitting to men, but not men submitting to women. Why is that? Why do we know better today? I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, why no verb? Why is there not a verb in this verse? And the answer is this was a typical Greek writing way to do this. You made a statement with a verb, and then the next statement you could infer that verb and not include it in the sentence. So the verb submit belongs here, but it wasn't written here. It was written in the verse before. So we got to ask ourselves, what was verse 21? Where did it come from? And this is huge. This is what Paul actually said before he said, wives, submit to your husband. This sets the tone for everything that will follow. Submit to one another in reverence to Christ. Every time that the Apostle Paul tells us to do something, he actually points us back to Jesus and when Jesus created that new rule. And so in love, in relationships, including romantic relationships, including marriage, we are supposed to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So here's what when we're talking about my hopes and your hopes that become each other's expectations, when we're talking about will you submit to my hopes, will I submit to your hopes, here's the big thing. Submission is mutual. This is what we've got to walk away with today. Submission, according to the Bible, according to Paul, is mutual. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, this word reverence right here that Paul uses, it's actually the word awe, as in I am in awe of Christ. You're in awe of Christ because he loves you, he forgives you no matter what you've done, no matter how you've messed up. It's translated into awe for what he did for us. Because the command to submit is actually mutual. It's mutual submission. It's that I'm here for you, you're here for me, and I'm not here for you because you're here for me. I'm here for you because out of reverence for Christ, because he was here for me, therefore I'm going to treat you like he treated me. I'm going to take everything that I am and I'm going to give it to you for what benefits you the most. And you're going to do the same. We can have different roles, responsibilities, but we don't have different values. We're valued the same. I'm telling you, for Jesus' audience, this would have been unbelievable. For Paul's audience, this would have been earth-shattering because he's making a very culturally disruptive point in this culture where this seems so sideways. And he starts with common ground between wives and husband, and the common ground was submission. That we submit to each other out of awe of Jesus and what he's done for us. So, Paul starts where there's common ground, and then he goes from there. And then he actually applies it to men as well. So here's what he says. We've read, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as you do to the Lord. And when we see this, his point is, ladies, I want you to place your husband, or your man if you're moving toward marriage, I want you to place his hopes as your own. Not because he expects it, not because you're beneath him, but because your heavenly Father requested you treat him as Jesus treated you. And here's what's next. And it would have an effect on the audience that we can't imagine, okay? It was so different. What Paul says next is actually so offensive to them in the same way that this is offensive to us and our culture. And here's what he says to the men. He says, husband, love your wives. Now to us, that's not offensive. Like, we're like, of course, you love your wife. But listen, back then, it was not of course. They would have said, I don't have an obligation to my wife. My wife has an obligation to me. Remember, I own her. But Paul's not even done yet. He says, husband, love your wives, and then he turns the screw some more. Just as Jesus loved the church and gave himself for her. Now, the guys would have been like, stop, whoa. We get that our wives should submit to us because that's cultural. But now you're telling us that we have a responsibility to our wives? You're suggesting, Paul, that there may be a sense of equality? Seriously? He's not done. He says, in the same way that husbands ought to love their wives, they should do it as their own unity. So men, your wives are one with you. And as many times as we've heard this, and as obvious as this seems to us, this was absolutely brand new to them because Paul was equating men and women as equal value. And this is so powerful. The church has taken this out of context. And the reason that we bristle when we hear wives submit to your husband is because our culture, our American culture, actually embraces equality of men and women. We're not the same, but we're equal. And so the minute that we hear something where somebody's supposed to submit to somebody else, it's like, Women. Guess who introduced the whole idea of equality of men and women to the whole world? Guess who is the first person with any authority to actually say we're equal? It was Jesus. It was Jesus. Can we have security help us out here? Thank you. Hey, honey, I love you. Her name's Honey, by the way. I'm not calling her Honey because of that. Honey, I love you. That's okay. We love you so much. So what Paul does, Jesus introduces this. Jesus rolls this out. And then the Apostle Paul springboards off of it and says, women, men, in God's eyes, you are equal value. And you're supposed to actually submit to one another. So, men, what is your life to you? Just put her before that. That's the point. Put her before your life and your hopes, but you can't do that as long as you've got a huge box of expectations between you. And ladies, you can't love your husband or submit to him as you mutually submit to each other if you've got this big box of expectations between you. We got to get rid of this and basically allow God to connect us. So here's what we have to do. We have to decide that he doesn't owe you anything. She doesn't owe you anything. You don't necessarily, it's not that you feel that way, it's just you decide you don't owe me anything, but I owe you everything. Melissa always says it this way, a marriage is not 50-50, a marriage is 100-100. Because if it's 50-50, the moment that I'm giving 59, there's a gap. But if it's 100-100 and it's overlapping, even if I have a bad day, we're still loving each other. And my love doesn't depend on your love, and your love doesn't depend on my love. That we love each other 100 because he first loved us. It has to be mutual. Why? Because Paul said, the Bible says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, out of reverence for him. Because of what Jesus did, not because you deserve it from each other even, but because of what he did for us. So, when you think about what's in your box, what's in your box? And have you accidentally handed it to them and expected your hopes to be fulfilled by them? So here's what I want to challenge us to do. I want you to sit down and I want you to ask your spouse, what's in your box? At some point, at the right time, ask them, what's in your box? I want you to ask them. And then the next thing that I want you to do, and this is going to be super hard for some of you, after you ask what's in your box, I want you to be quiet. Listen, Now, for some of you, I just let you off the hook because I prompted you to do this. And so when you do it, it's because I prompted you to, not because you don't already know what's in their box. Because without a prompting, the response could be, are you serious? We've been married for 20 years and you don't even know what's in my box? I just let you off the hook because I'm asking you to ask. So you can say, I already know. I'm pretty sure I already know what's in your box. But Micah asked me to ask, so what's in your box? And the reason we got to know what's in each other's box is because we sometimes don't even know what's in our own box. So be quiet, ask, and then be quiet and listen. And remember, by the way, if you ask your husband or your man what's in his box, there's a good chance that here's what he's going to say. Nothing. What's in your box? Nothing. We don't even know we have a box. We're not lying. We don't even know what's in our box. Unconscious. But we expect them to fulfill these undefined expectations, but it's like we need to talk about this. And look, I'm going to be transparent. For women, most of us men, we're scared to death of this box. We're scared, and guys, we're scared to talk about it, but we're expecting them to fulfill our hopes, and we won't even talk about it. And the truth is, it can be terrifying, but we got to talk about it. And I know relationships are hard, and a lot of us have scars and struggles as well, but the foundation for all of this is love. Look in Romans chapter 5. God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Because we receive God's heart. If you're a Jesus follower, his love is in there. And out of that love, it empowers us to love other people the exact same way that he loved us. And if you're not a Christian, you're not a Jesus follower, I want to encourage you, in just a moment, you're going to have a chance to accept his love so that he can put his love in your heart, that you could love other people, especially so that you could love that special someone. So, conflict's inevitable. You're going to have conflict. So don't run from it. Don't win at all costs and be that bully. But I want to encourage you to open up to your spouse. Talk about what's in your box. And as you do that, these unmet expectations, what we're trying to do is close the gap between our hopes and our reality and do away with that disappointment because we're actually talking and we're communicating to each other. So would you stand with me? I just want to pray a blessing over you.